Today, the Doctor Who review guide starts a series that will be a little different. This won't be a regular thing, just every now and again, particularly when it's relevant to a TV story that's being reviewed immediately before or after. But I think when looking at the history of Doctor Who, examining Big Finish and its impact is a very relevant and important thing to do. Because, well, they've been doing this for 26 years. I'm just only a year older than their first story, the one I'm reviewing today. Doctor Who itself was only about 10 years older than that when they started. They were way closer to the actual times on the show, the three Doctors they started with, than they are today. In fact, the broadcast of season 26 hadn't even reached its 10th anniversary yet. And, well, I think the most important stat is, they've now been doing it for as long as Classic Who was ever on the air to begin with. That's how long they've been part of the furniture for. Now, I'll admit, these days they are a pretty easy punching bag. Their glory days are well in the past, and nowadays they seem only a vehicle for fan-wank team-ups, where Missy and Jackie Tyler end up meeting some third-tier supporting character from a Pertwee story or something. Endless Time War stuff, which I was always fairly against doing at all, at least from the Doctor's point of view, and the saturation of which has certainly not helped my perception. Or, most egregiously in my view, stories done using impersonations of deceased actors. It just rubs me the wrong way. I don't care how much like the Third Doctor or the Brigadier they sound, and they don't particularly in my view, it's just a bit wrong. So no, these days they are not the powerhouse they once were, and I can't pretend I bought anything from them since the last series of Gallifrey I did with Romana, which was like 4 years ago, I think. So, trailers exist though, so I've been able to hear how much new actors don't sound like the originals, and no, none of it sounds like my cup of tea at all. But absolutely none of that can take away from how good Big Finish could, and honestly perhaps buried in underneath all the cameos and impersonations still can be when they're at their absolute best. Their golden years were a powerhouse of insanely creative storytelling and some of the greatest masterpieces of fiction to bear the name of this franchise. Many of them will be future reviews in this format, of course, so I won't dwell on it, but when you look back at their first 10 years or so and the consistent high quality, it really is astonishing. There were misses, Doctor Who's all-time worst piece of performed media for instance, but there always are. With anything. Back then you had so many hungry, talented writers whose beloved show had been off the air for so long, looking to flex their muscles, and equally talented actors who had no doubt signed up for the guarantee of a consistent and easy paycheck, suddenly realising that the characters were coming to life on the page far more so than they ever did at all on television. It breathed new life into a franchise that seemed like it was being slowly put out of its misery, and while it certainly made no bearing on the decision to return to TV, after all Big Finish is made for fans by fans and always has been, it's not mass media like the classic series was or New Who is, I think it's what kept fan hunger and interest alive long enough. And even after the show returned, Big Finish continued to do this. It carved out its own lanes and niches, and yeah, the steam eventually ran out, but it always does for everything. Whatever I want to say about modern Big Finish, it was unrealistic and always unrealistic to expect them to be able to carry on such high quality for so long. And eventually, as I said, the steam was going to run out, and that's fine. And while there's a lot of waffling crap these days, they still do produce excellent things. Everyone cheered when they brought back Christopher Eccleston and managed to do the impossible, make him enjoy and be excited for Doctor Who again. So, while listening to John Coleshaw not sound much like Nicholas Courtney is probably not going to excite anyone, it can still pull out the surprises when it needs to, and I'm sure we'll see more of them in the future as the impression apocalypse grows deeper. Perhaps though Big Finish's most important contribution to Doctor Who is however to its internal popular culture through so many of the concepts, characters and ideas it added. The classic original companions like Charlie, Evelyn, Erimem, Lucy, Hex, to name but a few, and so many explorations of the universe that make RTD's rubbish-looking Sea Devil series weep, Gallifrey or Jago and Lightfoot or any others that might spring to mind in your case. It's editions like these that really make it special. Nicholas Briggs and Co. changed the face of Doctor Who forever. Now, it may sound like I'm waffling a bit, and yeah, I am. Now, Big Finish does preserve a proper introduction, and I did mean to give it one, but the thing is with the Sirens at the time, it's a bit like trying to talk about the caveman episodes of An Unearthly Child. You have to preface talking about them with a long spiel about the history they started, and obviously about the first episode that preceded them, but we'll gloss over that, before you actually have to go to them because there's only so much talking about actors dressed as cavemen yelling fire you can do before it becomes tedious, and you realise there's not actually that much to say. That's not to say they're bad, it's just they're not particularly interesting or noteworthy, and you can move on pretty quickly. That's about the deal with the Sirens at the time. It's where they started. Well, not quite. They actually had to prove to the BBC they could do this properly before they were allowed the Who licence, so they made some Bernie Summerfield audios who had separate rights that they could get. I've never been particularly interested in Benny as a character or any other audio series. I didn't grow up with New Adventures novels, so there's no real factor of interest for me, but nothing against her either, but whatever. But this is where they started out with Doctor Who. So obviously there was going to be a lot that needed straightening out, But the end product didn't end up being bad, a bit like the Caveman episodes of Unearthly Child. See, that's where I was going with that. Oh, you already saw. Right. Anyway, the Sirens of Time is actually a bit of an odd one, as while Big Finish would sometimes do anthologies, even linked anthologies like this one, the usual main range format was of 4 half-hour episodes telling a single story, not unlike you found in the classic series, albeit the episodes tended to be actually a half hour rather than sort of 23 minutes. Now, it wasn't always a conventional story they were telling in this format, but a single story nonetheless. Sirens therefore gets off to a bit of a false start of having 3 connected mini-episodes, one for each of the 3 Doctors involved, and then bringing them together in the last episode. Thus, each Doctor gets about an hour each, which is about right to bring the concept of these audio adventures with each of them to the audience as sort of an initial taste. Now, given that Tom Baker at this juncture was extremely unlikely to be brought in, Hartnell, Troughton and Pertwee were dead, and Paul McGann was still the current Doctor at this point, although the fading memories of the TV movie meant it would be less than 2 years before he would join up, there are only 3 candidates for Doctors to be brought on, and I think Peter Davison, Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy were probably the best 3 Doctors to start doing something like this with. Creatively anyway, I suspect Big Finish probably would have been very happy to have Baker at this stage, as he was always the most marketable classic Doctor, but creatively going with these 3 was a huge opportunity to go much further than had ever been the case on TV, and really build far more of their characters, storylines and overall places in the universe than had ever been the case then. Of course, that was a long-term thing, and there was no such requirement to radically redefine these Doctors in the half hour they each had solo, just to reintroduce them to the audio's audience, and for the Doctors themselves it does that reasonably well. Davison, Baker and McCoy of course will step back into the roles like they never left, while even at this stage their voices are all sound a bit gravelier, something of course only got more noticeable as they've aged. There's still exactly the same spark and energy. The enthusiasm suddenly being rediscovered as they slip back into the roles is extraordinary. Colin Baker especially, who certainly is relishing his second chance, makes his voice carry all the authority it did on TV. As for what's on the page, well, it'd be helpful to look at the 3 mini-stories. We start with the 7th Doctor, who is dragged down to some distant planet to see some exiled war criminal, a Knight of Valicia, whatever he's called, the attempt by some alien robot assassin things to kill him by the planet he committed the war crimes against. We see a few nice sides of the 7th Doctor in this half hour, his heroism early on as he rescues the girl, showing the 7th Doctor was at his heart just as much of a traditional hero despite what a bastard he could be sometimes, and then his sense of morality later on as he protects the Knight, at first because he's unaware of his true identity, but still does so even afterwards. He's already serving his punishment of exile for these crimes, he doesn't believe in being judged during executioner, even this Doctor stands up for those rights. While this is a small bit of work that is effective, it has mostly gotten from reading between the lines. On the surface this segment is honestly a bit dull and slow, the robot assassins aren't particularly interesting, and despite a bizarre yet somehow kind of hilarious turn from future Evelyn voice actor Maggie Stables as an Eastern European mad housekeeper, it sort of makes sense in context, although not really. There's not a great deal to liven it up, actually. It feels a bit matter-of-fact, and it doesn't help that the audio mixing in this segment in particular is not great. It made some of the dialogue a little hard to understand. Overall, it's okay, but it's not the best of starts. Out of the 3 segments, the 5th Doctor's is undoubtedly the strongest. Set on the German submarine U-20 in the fateful hours in May 1915 before it torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, this is quite a gripping and tense piece that uses the most of its settings to tell quite a close claustrophobic tale. Captain Schwieger, played by Mark Gatiss of all people, is a brilliant character, a genuinely decent nobleman torn between duty, the demands of war, and controlling his own human savagery in the middle of such a conflict. Contrast his shock with his mind-controlled subordinate being forced to beat the Doctor half to death, and then contrast that with the ferocity when he sees the Lusitania on the scope, despite the fact she was obviously a civilian ship carrying women and children. Decent people suddenly driven to inhuman behaviour by war. Now, how accurate this was of the real man, fucked if I know, but it nevertheless creates a compelling central character and story. But not a complex one that you can easily fit within the confines of a single half-hour tale. The 5th Doctor is also on good form here, charming and pleasant of course, but also crafty and resourceful, and eventually capable of quite a lot when driven to desperation. All stuff that was done on TV, but it's an extension of much of those themes, and especially building on the Androzani model. But it's well done, and Davison relishes in getting his teeth into something more interesting as the situation shifts around him. As I said, out of the 3, this is easily the strongest. Finally, the 6th Doctor segment, and this is probably the weakest of the 3 for a few reasons. The character of the 6th Doctor is fine, feisty, cunning, crafty, never willing to give up control of a situation, but also with some of the arsehole tendencies he displayed on TV wisely toned down, and you can tell Colin Baker enjoys being able to play the Doctor in that sort of way. But the story itself is not great. The setting isn't very interesting, the story a bit confusing and technobabble laden, and not terribly engaging, and starts to become heavily dependent on the overall story stuff, which is just a bit confusing, and it's not very clear at points. It doesn't have the strength for the second segment or even the quite simple premise of the first segment to buoy it up. It's just a lot of talking and an oh look, a time monster. That leads us on to the final segment and the overall story where all three Doctors come together. On the plus side, they all have great chemistry and the back and forth is written very well. It's definitely what you'd expect from multi-Doctor banter. But on the other hand, the actual story is just a mess at this point. Gallifrey has been invaded by the titular Knights of Thingy-Majig, but we don't actually get to find out much about the Knights and why. It's just their one leader who is the female characters in all the other segments, more on that in a sec. And this dystopia over the subjugated Gallifrey nearly goes completely unexplored, the Doctor not terribly bothered this has happened to his own planet. The explanation of how time changed to allow it is dry exposition, and while I guess it's an interesting twist for the fact it wasn't the war that the Lusitania surviving affected, but instead allowing someone who's meant to die to kill Alexander Fleming and prevent penicillin being invented, as I said, it's an interesting twist. It's playing on the expectations a bit, but it does make all the stuff on the submarine feel less important. Shrieker's internal battle seems less weighty when it wasn't for the war that his decision had any effect. The reason the Knights did all this is to preserve their dying race, which is generic and has no real depth to their motivation, and it turns out said leader is actually a siren of time, which I don't think is an awful concept, a bit like a sort of parasite that feeds off changes in time, but it makes the whole thing seem over-elaborate, and as a villain she doesn't feel interesting enough. Well, the concept itself, it clearly didn't have legs to be reused many times anyway, so it's not like this was that great from Big Finish's point of view. None I can personally remember, although TARDIS Wiki tells me otherwise. So yeah, the overall story and ending is not great, but I think the piece as a whole is fine. It's enjoyable enough, passes the time well, it's great hearing these Doctors again, and I think it was a really good show of the potential the audios has. They were clearly finding their feet, and that meant some overly complex stories with too much focus on minutiae sometimes, and that's a very Doctor Who fan thing to do. The overall piece isn't hugely satisfying as one continuous story, but honestly I think that's a viable sacrifice to make when the idea was showing off all three Doctors on their own, and how well they would rediscover the spirits of their original performances and improve on them, and it shows the considerable potential that was there. Once this had been got out of the way, then they could start properly telling their full stories and developing from there. And they knew they were going to get, at least a bit of time where they could prove themselves. Not everything has to be proved here, but I think this was a good first shot. So overall, I'd give it a 5 out of 10. It's average for Big Finish. A sign of some of the issues that would come later, but overall a sign of some great potential that we quickly seized and met. So that's the first Big Finish review of mine. Obviously it's a lot shorter and less detailed than reviews I'd do for TV, and that will always be the case. These will always be a side thing rather than part of the main event, but I hope you enjoyed nonetheless. In fact, if there are any particular audios you like reviewed, please let me know, and I'll see if they can be slotted in at some point, although please main range only for the time being and within the first 10 years or so, because I probably won't have listened to it before it was any further than that. Anyway, hope you enjoyed.